Good morning.
Yeah.
I think we're about ready to start. I am Jane Stock, and I am ready to be your moderator for our panel discussion today on some of the subjects and topics that are covered in Candace Millard's book, Destiny of the Republic. I wanted to give you a little background today about kind of how the panel came to be, or at least from my perspective. Earlier in the year, when I was riding high on all the glowing praise from many sources, such as the New York Times book reviews claiming that Millard has written us a penetrating human tragedy, to the Wall Street Journal submission that her splendidly drawn portraits leave us feeling that Garfield's assassination deprived the nation not only of a remarkably humble and intellectually gifted man, but one who perhaps bore the seeds of greatness. And the excitement that I felt in my classrooms after our discussions of Garfield's life after reading the book, I was unprepared for the blunt response of my brother-in-law that he didn't really like all of the book. How can this be, I wondered. Most of us in the English department who were reading and teaching the book were so full of enthusiasm for it, due to the beauty with which Millard told Garfield's story. Her style and organization worked very well with the material. And even though we had to overlook some things, such as the fact she didn't use MLA documentation in her in her citations, and that we had found some places where she perhaps could have been more careful, we just were carried away and look at the unanimity of the wonderful tributes to her work in all those reviews. It was not, however, until I went to our JCC book club to discuss Steve Inskeep's Jackson Land, President Andrew Jackson, Cherokee Chief John Ross, and a great American land grab that Ty Edwards, our history panelist today, helped me to view Millard's Destiny of the Republic, A Tale of Madness, Medicine, and the Murder of a President in a new perspective. Going back to those reviews, I noticed many distinctions being made about the book by some critics. An achingly good, suspenseful read, compelling characters, and nail-biting storytelling, said our own K.C. Starr. Keeping tight on her narrative strands, rich in detail and emotion, adds Salon, while Booklist claims that Destiny stands at the crossroads of popular and professional history. I realize that what might seem to students and outsiders as a serious disconnect, an inherent disagreement between disciplines, wasn't perhaps that at all. Just as we must look at different levels of research writing and documentation, from the PhD dissertation with its lengthy list of internal citations and bibliographic entries, and the article in a popular science magazine with no parenthetical citations at all, so must we learn that each department has its own expectations, assumptions, and standards that it uses as evaluative tools. With that in mind, we have formed today's panel and included some of our best professors from 4 of JCC's departments to show us their perceptions of the job that Ms. Millard did in presenting the case of James Garfield and of recreating his place in the Gilded Age. Although I'm sure that our panelists will cover the subject in much more detail, I wanted to say that the term Gilded Age was created by Samuel Clemens, or Mark Twain as he is better known, when he used it as the title of a satire he wrote making fun of the period in the latter half of the 19th century. As he said in his usual sardonic way, what is the chief end of man? To get rich. In what way? Dishonestly, if we can. honestly if we must. To be gilded obviously means only to have a thin veneer of gold over the outside of an object. Therefore, this era was one that, rather like the Roaring Twenties in some ways, glittered with wealth and great industrial progress while masking many hidden problems that Millard reveals to us in her account of Garfield's life and death. Now, let's get to our panel members to hear their perspectives on the book. We're going to start with Matthew Schmier, representing literature.
All right. So, good morning. I am going to cover primarily the structure of her book. As Jane pointed out, this was our common read book that we chose mainly because we love the storytelling. And so when we look at what makes this a good story, there are several factors that come into play. So I'm really looking at this idea of how does our discipline, English, kind of evaluate this work, and how is this different than a scholarly work? And what makes this interesting for us to read, and interesting for you as someone who perhaps is not a member of our discipline, something that engages us to read. So first we have to think about the context here in which she's writing. Obviously, Garfield's assassination is a well-known historical event. We know it happened. It was covered by the newspapers at the time, which were like the internet of their day, right? I mean, you didn't Instagram or tweet something, you published it in the paper 3 or 4 times a day in most cases. There have been numerous academic research articles written on Guiteau and Garfield and their interactions and all of the various themes that we'll talk about in today's panel presentation. So there's tons of research that's out there. And given those two things, Millard doesn't present any new knowledge. She doesn't present a new angle, a new interpretation on what happened. She doesn't present new, groundbreaking facts that no one has ever seen before. She is basically treading common ground that many historians and many researchers have already covered. So why do it, right? We already know the ending. Everybody dies. Spoiler, right? We know that. So how do you make something where you already know what happened interesting? And what that comes down to is thinking about the rhetorical approach. Number one, she is not writing for academics. We know that. This is a general audience. It's a popular novel. I keep saying novel because it seems like it is a novel. She's using novel writing techniques. It's a book. We know it. It's nonfiction. It's history. It's popular history. She's writing for a general audience, as Jane alluded to. There's no in-text citation. None whatsoever. No footnotes. No endnotes. No little ones, twos, where you have to look down at the bottom and figure it out. Her bibliographic system is she quotes part of her sentence at the back in a notes section and tells you where she got that from. That is a very non-standard citation system in the academic world. It's something that we see in popular fiction, popular writing and popular nonfiction all the time. So it's very casual. In fact, it's so casual, her reference list is incomplete. She has tons of newspaper sources that she uses. Try to find one in her bibliography. They're not there. She doesn't cite any instance of a newspaper article in her reference list, right? She's using primary sources, sure. She's got the journals and the letters and the papers from the Presidential Library and from Brown's historical record in his journal. She's got all that stuff, but then she's relying on other historians for the majority of her work, right? Not only that, she has, as again Jane pointed out, moments of impossible conjecture. How can she tell us what someone is thinking at some point in time? She can't. She's imagining and recreating a situation based on the notes and the sources that she has in front of her. So what she is actually doing is building what we call creative nonfiction, right? She is pulling together history and presenting it in a dramatic way to make it more interesting for us, the general reader. So she has to rely on narrative, storytelling methods, right? But this is not a straightforward beginning, middle, end story. It's not. Ain't gonna happen. Yes, it seems like it's a beginning, middle, end story because we see Garfield at the beginning and we see him die and that seems like the end, but it really isn't. All right, so we think a story basically really simplistic way of thinking of story is this model, right? There's lots of other models out there, as Kurt Vonnegut will tell you, but this one's really easy. Exposition, rising action, climax, resolution. We look for those 4 things to kind of map out stories, right? So we think that this is all about Garfield, and so we get a lot about Garfield's life, and we get Garfield's political life and his rising, and then we get his assassination, and then he dies. And that seems like his story throughout the book, but it's not. What makes this interesting? Well, number one, it's not just one story. It's many stories. Not only do we have Garfield stories, we have Guiteau's, we have Alexander Graham Bell's, we have Conkling, who is a minor character in some respects, but he's actually mentioned more in the book than some of the other characters. And we have Bliss, who pops up halfway through the book, kind of a surprise, here I am to kill you. And he kind of comes out of nowhere, but then he becomes very important in the last half of the book. We don't have one protagonist, we have 2. We like Garfield, he's our central. But it's also the story of Bell and his race to invent a magnometer that will detect the bullet in the president's body. And so these 2 guys are kind of matched neck and neck throughout the book, right? In terms of, we root for them, right? Come on, Garfield, you can pull through. No, we know he isn't, right? Come on, Bell, you can do it. Yeah, he can, but he gets foiled, right? Oh, foils? We don't have 1 foil, we have 4. So Guiteau isn't the only bad guy here. We have Conkling and Arthur who are over here, contriving to upset the balance of the Republican Party. And then we have Bliss who pops up, and he's kind of a tragic villain. He isn't really a bad guy. He's just extremely misguided and driven by hubris, right? And so he screws up, and as the argument can go, maybe he killed the president out of ignorance, right? We also have 6 minor focus characters, some with their own story arcs in the story. So if we look at Lister, who's only mentioned 3 times in the book, by the way. But Lister's kind of important because he sets the stage for one of the major themes in the book, which is medicine, right? So we have Lister, we have Conkling and Arthur, we have Lucretia, we have Brown, and we have Bliss, all minor characters that pop up in the story that are important to look at. We don't have just one major theme, we've got 5. So it's not just about assassination, it's about politics, it's about insanity in the Gilded Age, it's about invention, and it's also about medicine. So these 5 themes kind of intermingle all throughout. So how does she do it? Well, sure, we've got story here. We've got Garfield's story, and we see him throughout the course of the book. We also have Guiteau's story. We see his early life, his turn to kind of being a scam artist, his decision, after he survives the wreck of the 2 steamships to go and kill the president, and then we have his eventual hanging. We have Bell's story. We don't get his full life, we just get, hey, guy invented the telephone, he got rich, here's how he's struggling to keep his business afloat in the face of trademark and patent disputes. And then we get him trying to save the president dies, and then he lives the longest out of all these characters in the book, right? I mean, there's pictures of Alexander Graham Bell with his big old Santa Claus beard sitting with his grandchildren. He had a good long life. And then there's Conkling's story, and you're probably saying, what, Conkling's a major character here? Well, no, but he pops up a lot. In fact, Conkling pops up more than Bliss in the book, right? So we have Conkling coming and showing up as being someone who already has power and is fighting against the president for political influence. He resigns his seat. That's the climax of his story. And then he kind of falls from grace because people think that he might have been involved in killing the president, right? And then he dies after walking through a bad storm. Way to go, right? Bliss's story. He is a guy who's got a background, he's trying to redeem himself. He was accused of quackery, bad medical ethics. He gets involved to save the president, and that's the majority of his story in here, is his trials and failures to save the president. The president dies, same climactic point, and then he sends Congress the bill, right? And so we know that happens. So when we overlap all of these, they look like a bad computer logo from the 1970s, right? So we've got all these overlapping story arcs that are working for us here. But they're not just overlapping. They're actually entwined. I keep hitting the microphone, I'm sorry. They're actually entwined. They're braided, right? When you think of braiding hair, what you're doing is you're taking separate strands and weaving them together to create a whole. And that is what makes this story interesting. she is weaving characters together. We can see this by looking at how often she puts characters as a focus in passages. So if you look in the book, and you look at, she starts off talking about a character, and then there's a little bit of white space, and she jumps to start talking about another character. This is the pattern, right? So first thing that I want to point out is the numbers down by their names. That's how often someone's name by itself pops up. Not possessive, it's just that person's name. So you can see that Conkling is actually mentioned more in the book than Bliss, if you just look at these pure numbers, right? So I went through and I labeled these according to when they pop up in the book, right? So we start off with Gateau. Gateau gets the prologue. And then we jump to Garfield. And then we're at to Belle, and then we're to Lister, then we're to Garfield. This is when they're at the exposition and she's setting things up. And then Garfield gets a whole chapter to himself because we're getting his life story. And then we get Garfield, and then we bring in Conklin, his political rival. And then we're back to Garfield. That's his getting elected, nominated to the presidency. And then we jump to Gateau, whole focus on Gateau, right? So we see this bouncing back and forth a lot. Well, obviously we can see this and we see some patterns popping up, right? Well, look right around 9, 10, 11, and 12. What happens? It's all Garfield and Gateau. Right smack in the middle of the book, it's the climactic moment, the assassination attempt. She jumps back and forth between those characters primarily in here. It's not a straight pattern because in chapter 9, she introduces us talking to Lucretia, who's the one who's going to have heartbreak here when the president dies. So she introduces him and then jumps to Garfield Gateau. Oh, we're not going to talk about one foe in this chapter. We're going to talk to the other foe. People, it seems, it's ganging up on Garfield. Gateau's out there plotting to kill him. Conkling's out there plotting to somehow wrest power away from him. And we look at this pattern and say, yeah, there's something going on dramatically here. Notice something else. Where does Bliss show up? Boom, chapter 12, President shot, he pops up. And then notice that whenever Bliss shows up, he's never the focus of a chapter when it starts. He pretty much is always last place, almost continually in the book. Rather interesting when we look at it. The epilogue, by the way, is kind of like after the movie, Where Are They Now? So it's a really big list of here's what happened after the president died, right? Yeah. So that's what we get at the end. So if you look halfway through the book, what happens is Garfield is no longer the primary person that we're following. Belle becomes the primary person that we're following, and his race to save the president. This is why we have two protagonists, right? Now listen, you guys have seen this before. You see it all the time if you watch TV and you go to the movies and you see these in stories. Every single major sort of television show or major movie with an ensemble cast does this. We're going to follow these characters for a little while, then we're going to jump to another little character for a little while, and then we're going to jump to another character, and then bring you back to the character that we looked at. Why? It creates suspense. It creates drama, which is what Millard is trying to do here. She knows that we know Garfield dies, but maybe we've forgotten how he dies and the process the battles that he fought, etc. So that's really important here. Now we can break these strands apart even further, and if you really want to see going beyond just counting how often characters are mentioned, we could do some textual analysis, okay? And so taking an ebook version, stripping the DRM out of it, making it plain text, running it through some textual analysis software, we can get really fine. For example, do you want to know how often things happen during the day? Sure, we can show you. How often does she mention the terms night, morning, evening, afternoon, or noon? When does the majority of the book take place? It's kind of hard to see. It's a screenshot. The majority of this book takes place at night and takes place in the morning. We can look at that and say, when are people doing stuff? Hey, there's no electricity. When are people going to be doing stuff? In the night and in the morning. Pretty basic, right? So if we can then look at the characters. Here's the main characters and how they interact over the course of the book. I know it's kind of fuzzy. This is a screenshot, and I had to fit it in. But you can see that Garfield is the green line here. And he takes up the majority of the first part of the book. And if you notice, Gateau closely kind of parallels him. He's the blue line, the other one that's looping pretty high. But right after chapter 12, all of a sudden, who takes off? Belle and Conkling. Belle and Bliss start popping up. So we can see, yeah, she's kind of done a whammy on us here. Garfield, sure, he's our main character. But after the major moment of the assassination, everybody's trying to save his life. He's no longer the forefront character that we're rooting for. We've got these other two. Notice that Belle and Bliss are opposed to each other. That what she's done is she switched it from Guiteau and Garfield to Belle versus Bliss, the race to save the president. Who's going to do it? We can also look at that political adversary across the board. So we can look at Garfield, Conkling, and Arthur, and we can say who is doing what and when. Notice right here, right before the president gets shot, Conkling is blue and Garfield is green. They're neck and neck with each other, both at the moment, as often as they're mentioned, and they're about to cross, but they don't. She's just focusing on them about the same. And then right here where people are asking, who killed the president? Was Garfield involved was Arthur and Conkling involved? Oh, maybe. This is the whole, like I like to say, the conspiracy chapter, where that discussion is happening, and we see all of a sudden Conkling kind of drop off in mentions and Arthur kind of take off. We can also just look at the struggle to save the president's life and who's in charge. So between the president, Lucretia, and Bliss. Notice that Lucretia, not mentioned much here at all until around chapter 6. Takes us 6 chapters to get to the president's wife, right? And even then, she's not mentioned very much until the president is shot. Again, right around here, and then we have the battle for who should be in control. Fairly basic to look at that. We can also look at the major themes. So if we think about those 5 major themes that I threw out there, we can look at invention, medicine, assassination, politics, and insanity. And that little star, by the way, you can barely see it. It's a wild card character. So I'm looking for the terms invent, inventor, invention, and how often those appear. And you can see, obviously, that invention becomes very heavy around chapter 6. That's the one focused on Belle. But then invention pops up again down here in these chapters where Belle is trying to save the president. Notice that insanity is a theme that kind of pops up, but it really goes off the charts back here. So much so that I couldn't even fit it in the screenshot, right? And these are the chapters dealing with his trial. Guiteau's trial. So we can look at how often is she using words or related sets of words to pull out those themes. And as you can see, these themes really are intertwined. So what makes this interesting? She's written a book that's extremely complicated with how she's braided not just the characters, but the storylines and the themes. And because it's so tight like this, it feels more engaging and it feels more dramatic than reading a plain old history book of just names and dates. Right? And that is what makes this an interesting piece of writing. Doesn't make it an accurate piece of writing, as my other 3 panelists will probably discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Okay, and now Ty is going to come and let you in on all of the secrets she let me in on from the historical perspective. Okay, come on, Ty.
All right, so I'm a historian. I'm glad that she prepared you that I might talk a lot of crap on the book. So prepare yourself. All right, so what historians do, Matt, is not just write about names and dates. What historians do is take historical events and tell you why they are important and what they meant to the people at the time and what we can do with that information today. So for my view, this book is a nice story, perhaps for you a gateway drug into historical interest, but it does not teach you anything, I would argue, about history in this period. So let me elaborate on why. First, this is a story about great white men, great white military veterans and politicians. How new, right? No one's heard of them. When Millard was on campus last semester, I asked her this. I asked, your books are all about great white men. Do you have something to say about that? And she said that those are where the sources are. And I tried not to barf. Because, of course, historians are doing all kinds of research on all kinds of other people all the time. And this myth that only great white men have sources is not the case. But they do have very nicely preserved sources in really nice libraries that are easy to get to and you know where they are. So that's fun, right? So these are sources that are accessible and easy to use. All right, another thing we need to point out is this book characterized politics as a game of personalities, which it wasn't. It was much more complicated than that. Whenever you have something that's characterized as personalities, I'm always a little uncomfortable with that because that's teaching you as students that politics is something that's hard to make change and that it's really just a game of those people involved. And I find that disempowering and disingenuous and inaccurate, so we'll deal with that in a second. Also, African Americans and women, and in one paragraph, immigrants, are used as window dressings to support the narratives and transformations, again, of great white men, which was not the case, and it was also problematic. As Matt was pointing out, it takes forever to get to the fact that Garfield was even married and what role she played in his life. Okay, so my biggest problem with this book is there's absolutely no historical context, which is why you just learn interesting stories, and I would argue trivia, about a handful of dudes, and you walk away from this being like, that was neat. That's not what history is about. It's not about things being neat. All right, so first, politics in this period was organized in the party boss system. She does use the words party bosses a couple of times, but doesn't tell you what that means or who that was. All right, so the party boss system was really developed by Irish immigrants, particularly in New York and other East Coast cities, who were discriminated against overwhelmingly in the culture at the time and struggled to get employment or to have a voice. So they started using corruption, what you might call gangs and corrupt fraud in politics, in order to get power, in order to get employment. This system was highly effective in getting people elected to office and then getting kickback wealth to many of the people who are part of it. So you start seeing the parties, both parties, all across the country start employing this system. So when she characterized Garfield getting into politics sort of by accident and, you know, not really owing anything to anyone, and he was just this noble, selfless man who accidented into the presidency. Again, I was gagging and barfing. So, Gilded Age politics was a game of spoils, right? She talks about one of the big outcomes of his death is Americans supposedly ended the spoils system, which was dramatically overstated. But Garfield was one of the major players in his party. That's why he is nominating people at the convention, and that's how he ends up president in the first place. So Garfield, for example, is a big player in the end of Reconstruction. She characterized Garfield throughout the book as an abolitionist, right? She even throws in token Frederick Douglass saying that you should vote for Garfield. Garfield may have been an abolitionist before the war. He may have been a Civil War veteran. But the things he did right before he became president was help negotiate Hayes's fraudulent entrance into office. Hayes, who was the president right before him, the Republican president, may not have won that election. He certainly didn't get the vast majority of votes, and the politicians that helped get him in, one of which was Garfield. Then Garfield also helped negotiate what's called the Compromise of 1876 or 77, which is basically the removal of federal troops from the South to ensure the civil rights of freed slaves and African Americans are guaranteed. And so Garfield abandons his abolitionism in arguably its most desperate moment. And this is what leads to Jim Crow America, lynchings, other kinds of segregation and discrimination against African Americans. That is, of course, never mentioned, and he's characterized as some advocate of black rights, which certainly would have been disputed at the time. Another thing that I found sort of appalling is that Americans were united by Garfield. Did I mention Reconstruction and not advocating for black rights? Not exactly. While he was in Congress, he also was a big advocate against labor unions and the use of military force against workers who strike and protest. This was particularly hard on working class workers and especially immigrant Americans, who are often most of those exploited laborers. So that's something that we need to remember in terms of his unification. Also, I find it interesting, and Matt talked about this, that Guiteau and Garfield in a lot of the text are used as sort of opposites of one another. So she goes on and on multiple times about Garfield's abject poverty in his youth, which I kept being a little confused by because his mother owned property, eventually donates that property somewhere, and he and his siblings are able to work to send him to college. And then they talk about Guiteau's poverty, which seemed actually abject throughout the text, but his is more, based on his own laziness. So there's a lot of value judgments about one's poverty in this. Also, I felt like madness was conveniently and inconveniently deployed. Graham Bell's madness was acceptable because it led him to invent things that save lives. We like that. Guiteau's madness, however, was not deployed in ways that we should think about in terms of medicine. So when it came to Garfield's health, right, she talked a lot about had he have been shot at a later point, medicine would have been able to save him, and the structures of medicine would have been much more effective. Guiteau, when would he have gotten the mental health care that he deserved? How come that's not pointed out at any point in the text? If something's relevant today, it's how does someone end up being a person that wants to become a lone shooter, assassinate someone, and believe they're justified? That sounds relevant. Let's investigate that in terms of madness and mental health. All right, so she does, I was appalled to find it, get to an argument at the end of the text. Popular history often does not try to prove something or argue something, but she does, at the very end of the book in the epilogue, try to say what this whole book was about. So she claims that Garfield's death brought change. Okay, one of these things I've already had a problem with. She claimed that he united the divided post-Civil War nation. This is dramatically overstated. Again, his abandonment of African American rights, his policies against immigrants and working class laborers are a problem there. And she just paints the whole American public in broad brushes. Now, it is the case that often after presidential assassinations, Americans love the president a lot more than they did the day before the assassination. John F. Kennedy, after he was assassinated, numerous percentage points of Americans claimed they had voted for him that had definitely not in the previous last election. So being shot does get one sympathy when you're in the presidential position. Okay, so she also says that Garfield's death then leads people to want to prevent such tragedies in the future. Well, sort of, because you know McKinley is assassinated not that long after this. Of course, then Kennedy, as I mentioned, also is assassinated later. So sort of varying commitments are seen to that. And then, and here's the big one, right? She claims that Garfield's assassination ends the spoils system, right? Arthur gets his crap together, he's a changed man, and he helps Congress make sure they pass civil service reform. Okay, well, and then she stops it there. The original civil service reform that was passed only protected 14%, not a majority, of federal employees from losing their jobs in the next presidential election. That is a teeny tiny little group. So are there a lot of federal employees after this that are still getting their job based on the spoils system? Yes. In fact, most people argue that the only reason why the spoils system eventually is totally undone is every time a president and Congress are in power, they want to expand the number of jobs that are part of civil service reform because they just appointed a bunch of people to fill those jobs and they want them to keep jobs later in case their party isn't in power anymore, right? So you don't see any of that. Okay, so she titles this book something that I'm surprised wasn't a bigger part of the text, The Destiny of the Republic. Okay, warning. Whenever you're studying history and you hear anything that says destiny, you're like, total crap, it should start. Because destiny implies that it's meant to be and people don't make choices. That's not what history is about. History is the study of the choices people make. Bad choices, maybe, uninformed choices, selfish choices, choices under duress, but choices. Nothing happens by accident, which again, I hate those kinds of terms because it's teaching students or popular readers that your choices don't matter, which is not true. All right, your choices do matter and you should act them out in both politics and your life. So, destiny of the Republic. Garfield's death does not determine the destiny of the Republic. In fact, you could argue the course of the Republic only turns in a minor way after his death, right? The spoils system is still part of it, party politics and political bosses still part of this. So one of the things that you need to remember about this text is it reduced the complexities of economic change, racial, class, and ethnic divides, and political corruption into one man's supposedly noble story of life and death. In a better context, if you take a history class here at JCCC and you learn about the Gilded Age in this period, what you'll actually learn about is the fact that the Gilded Age is what we would today call America's developing nation period. The United States was developing its economy into a capitalist economy that eventually becomes globally competitive. In so doing, lots of bad things happen. So Americans struggle with this economic change. There's widening wealth gaps, monopolies, exploitation of workers, labor activism. The big question was, of course, who had the power? And then things that, of course, still are relevant is that there was a diversifying nation because of it. Many people start immigrating to the United States for hopeful employment opportunities, and this is something Americans are uncomfortable with as well. So if we want to think how the Gilded Age is relevant to today, some of the big questions of the time were, what was the role of government in business and labor and economic practices? Throughout this period, both major political parties believed it was their job to help business, to help leaders who are entrepreneurs, and to help those who are wealthiest in society. Of course, a lot of laborers disputed that turn of events. There was also a question about what's the role of government in protecting the rights of all Americans. The federal government totally abandoned its constitutional responsibility to protect the civil rights of African Americans after Reconstruction. Of course, women don't have the right to vote during any of this period. And you see a lot of people, also as exploited workers, feeling like the nation no longer represents them. And then the question, of course, by the end of the Gilded Age becomes, how do we fix these problems? How do we reform this system? How do we ensure that the Republic does have a future? And that's why, once we get to the 20th century, politicians and people in society start making changes, slowly, to reform the system. So, if you'd like to know more, if you'd like to be empowered, read about history that you can relate to, take a history course. Thank you.
Hi. I'm curious, who we have in the audience? Any people that are thinking maybe healthcare down the road? A few of you? Great. All right. Once a nurse, always a nurse, right? Absolutely. So thank you, Marilyn, for knowing that I'm a nurse and that I might have something to contribute to the book, but certainly not as much as you all with your historical and your research abilities. But I've been a nurse a long time, and I also have the honor of doing some work in developing countries. So learning about infection from the perspective of this writer and the book was really quite fascinating for me, and thinking about, really what contributed to Garfield's death. And certainly it didn't take me long to realize it was the fact that he didn't have a good nurse taking care of him. Somebody who knew how to be an advocate and care for somebody body, mind, and spirit. It just was not happening for him. I just felt so sorry for him, how isolated he was and shielded. But then, you think back and you think about Dr. Bliss. I thought that was very interesting that his first name was Doctor. And the Hippocratic Oath, which was really back, he died in 370 BC or something like that, so a very long time ago, he wrote about, Hippocrates wrote about do no harm. And still to this day, many physicians and medical programs have in their oath, the Hippocratic Oath of do no harm. And so you wonder, did he know that he was doing harm? What do you think? Do you think Bliss knew, and when in the story did Bliss maybe figure out that what they were doing maybe was causing harm? Did you wonder about that a little bit? I know I certainly did many times. It was just jumping out off the page. But so what killed the president? And so we know in reading the book that it was really not the actual shooting. The bullet itself did not, for instance, lacerate his liver. I think that was one of the concerns, that they thought that maybe that bullet would become dislodged wherever it was, and then he would die because it was dislodged. So what were they trying to do? What were all these people that were poking their finger?
Find the bullet.
Yeah.
Trying to do? Find the bullet, right? And so just kind of digress for a moment. How many of you have washed your hands today?
You better raise your hand. That's gross. That's gross.
It's gross of you.
So as we read this story, it becomes so apparent, hand washing was just not something that was that easy to do then.
Yeah.
But certainly the knowledge of hand washing and antisepsis was discovered. It's just that in America it certainly wasn't practiced yet. And so it was also before the use of X-ray. So the timing of Garfield's demise is some of these things that were kind of on the cusp of being used, especially not yet in America. But X-rays, it was about 14 years before the use of X-ray. But certainly I really enjoyed learning more about Bell's contribution and the storyline with Bell and how hard he worked. It was so important to him to be able to make an impact and save the president, and he worked really hard. And honestly, I think he would have if Bliss hadn't have been so arrogant and not let him, use the machine on the other side of his body, right? So I actually think that, his invention really did do a lot as they moved forward. And then I had to talk about nursing care and how the nursing care lack of certainly contributed to his death. He was malnourished. How much weight did he lose? Like 70, 80 pounds or something like that in just a couple of months. And, I really, as long as I've been a nurse, never really heard of feeding people rectally like they were doing.
Right.
So that was kind of a new one to me. But, you think about as people recover from illness, and if you've ever been really sick or you know somebody that is, and they're just kind of not able to get up and move around and interact with their normal world, that isolation and depression that can kind of set in too. So he was being so deprived in many ways, not just those contaminated fingers being poked into his wound, which was, of course, the major contribution to that. So the autopsy, when it was released, and boy, she was just so graphic, even being a nurse and seeing a lot of stuff, sometimes reading that was just like, oh, okay, enough. But it was released after the autopsy that the cause of the infection, was not, that it was the infection that caused the death, and that the bullet was actually protected in like a cyst, so just like some tissue that had formed. He probably would have been up and healed within a couple of days, had they just left him alone. And so as the story told, many people post-Civil War were walking around with bullets in them. But this tragic loss brought about really the acceptance of asepsis into the American medical care. And that's one of the things I found really interesting within the first chapter of the book. We learn about Lister and how he was at the Centennial Fair and he was trying to convince, these colleagues in America of how important asepsis, or sterilizing your surgical instruments and washing your hands and treating wounds, that was all being practiced already in Europe, in England. And so he'd proven that his death rate from his patients dropped from 45% to 15% in using these principles. But the arrogance, really, and just the unwillingness to accept this type of research was just not happening yet here in America. And so that really, I think, contributed. There's just some other, I think, things that I was just researching about, just historical development of finding out about infections, and that I found that to be just kind of interesting, and did a little extra reading about that. And one of the things is, I cannot say the name of this Hungarian doctor, but in the late 18th, early 19th century, in delivering babies at home, women weren't dying from that. But when hospitals started opening and being used more, they were deplorable. They were filthy. And the death rate from infection from women giving birth and babies was much higher in those environments. So that realization too, and I thought maybe that contributed to the fact that there weren't a lot of hospitals, but why was he taken care of in the filthy White House, and not a hospital? It was probably because the hospital wasn't any better, possibly. She didn't really explore that. And certainly also there was, the awareness of just the germ theory that was already coming to knowledge, and also vaccinations that were all really being developed at that time. But we, as America, I think still a fairly new country, we just weren't adapting all that yet. So the 1800s brought knowledge of the cultivation and identification of microorganisms that can cause infection, and really the study of infection is just fascinating. Vaccines were being developed, pasteurization we talked about, and then just that appreciation of the environment and its relationship to infectious disease started, the realization that they needed to think more about the environment where people were being taken care of, and sanitation. And, I had to also talk about Florence Nightingale a little bit here, even though the book never mentioned her. But back in the mid-1800s is when she really came into the field of nursing and opened a nursing school in 1860. But it wasn't just her emphasis on hygiene and sanitation practices. She was also a really good advocate. So I could just envision her and Bliss having an interaction, right? And listening to him, and then respectfully saying, well, this is how we need to do it. And just trying to help shape that practice. I think she was a wonderful advocate, and many people use much of her research to this day in developing good nursing programs. So sepsis was really what caused his death. And what is sepsis? Because it's around, and it's not going away, sadly. And a lot of people here in our own country die from sepsis every year. And so I even took the opportunity to give you a little handout over here about sepsis and what it is so that you can be aware of it. Because you're going to know people that are sick. You yourself might have an infection someday that if it's not properly treated could develop into this. It's also, in the layman terms, called blood poisoning, a life-threatening medical condition. And it's the primary cause of death from infections despite all the advances that we have in healthcare. And you know, your body, when you cut it, what's it normally do when you have a little cut? Gets red, right? And that's supposed to happen because your little blood cells migrate in to help the wound healing, carrying in the wound fighters, the white blood cells, and the clotters, the platelets. But sometimes our immune system reaction goes overboard. And that's when you can have sepsis occur, the infection carrying throughout the bloodstream into multiple organs and multiple organ failure. And that's really what I think, you know, we obviously see happen to Garfield in the end. It took a long time. Man, that guy, I can't believe how he hung on through all the things that were happening to him. But in the end, whoops, that's that really disturbing slide that I had to show, modern day slide. You know, was that the inflammation that was being caused, and I think maybe an artery rupturing, and he had that sudden cardiac chest pain, you know, from the failure of his cardiovascular system. But he was obviously in shock as well. You know, his breathing was very labored, and he was in the process of really, I think, dying more than once. I think he kind of had several lives that he was able to battle through there. I know I couldn't resist this slide, but this just kind of shows how the process of how sepsis and getting into the bloodstream and the overreaction of the body takes hold, and then it causes septic shock and multiple organ failure. Couldn't find a good one for him. So I had to end my talk with what can you do to prevent sepsis?
Good, that's good.
Stay
Don't
healthy.
get shot.
Stay healthy. Septic shock, yeah.
Don't get shot.
Don't get shot. Please don't get
Yeah.
shot. Take care of yourself, you know, get vaccinations. Wash your hands is the biggest thing, still to this day. And for those of you that are really interested, I do have a good little handout on from World Sepsis Day. We really are trying to educate, and we laugh, but really that's like
Right there with the World
200,000
Ice Cream
people.
Day.
I do
in
not
our
want
own
to see the
country
cake
die of
for World Sepsis Day.
So, anyway, I am going to stop and hopefully take some questions when we're done. You're welcome.
Happy Sepsis Day. Here's an infection.
Hi, I'm Jay Nadelman.
Oh, it's great.
And I'm from the Legal Studies Department here at Johnson County Community College. And I'm going to make mine pretty brief and direct because I am approaching this as an attorney. I really want to focus in on the legal issues. And there are actually two legal issues in the case, but I'm really going to focus in on the one I think is more fun, which is insanity. The second legal... Insanity's fun, right? My undergraduate was psychology, so they kind of go together. The second legal issue that was a major legal issue in the case, and I also have a handout if anybody wants to pick out, because I'm not going to get into all these details because you don't want to hear all these details. But the second major legal issue was I didn't kill the president, the doctors did. And so that's another one that we can explore in the question period if you have interest and want to do so. There's actually a third legal issue that's so boring nobody, not even attorneys, want to talk about it, and that is jurisdiction. He was shot in D.C. D.C. was somewhat still of a new entity. It was right on the borderline of Maryland. One of the things was arguing is you're bringing me to trial in D.C., and it should have been in the state of Maryland, and so all this is null and void, let me go.
Huh.
But again, that gets into details that nobody wants to really think about.
I like that.
Okay, so first question. I really want audience participation on this because you guys have all read the book, heard enough, you know about it. And the question is, was he insane?
Yes.
Yeah, and there's a good reason. Everybody thinks he's insane, right? You guys all think he's insane, right? Okay, anybody not?
Your only source.
Okay, we have one person. And the reason
there's one
why,
behind
and the
you.
reason why you don't think the reason why everybody thinks he's insane, and I'll have to go back to the English discussion of it, is that there was a whole narrative that was put together that only gave you information that's insane. Again, going to my handout, this whole first page are all the things that she said about why he was insane. But even though there are trial transcripts available, and even though there's an appellate transcript available with other information, you don't get to hear about that information because it doesn't really work with the narrative. And as an attorney, and I practiced law for 20 years, whenever I interviewed people and the stories all were just perfect and everything fit together, kind of makes you kind of go, there's something else going on here. So we're going to have a very short discussion about what the legal standard is. We're going to basically approach this very quickly as an attorney. So we're going to look, what's the legal standard? Because you can't just look at somebody insane in a vacuum, because you can be medically insane, you can be whackers, as your friends may think of you, but legally insane, you have to meet a specific standard. And also in the legal situation, we don't look at everything that happened and what happened. Specifically, you have to have credible evidence that a jury can consider. We're going to talk about the burden of proof, because that deals with the outcome of a case. We're going to look at who's the finder of fact. And finally, we're going to talk about the standard on appeal, and we'll wrap it all up. And we're going to do this really quickly. So to be judged legally insane, she had the right standard, which at the time, it was called the McNaughton Rule. And the McNaughton Rule required two things. You had to have a disease of the mind, and that disease of the mind had to either keep you from knowing the nature or quality of your act, or if you did know, you didn't know it was wrong. And we are talking not nuanced terms here, but if I have a knife, I would have to know that this knife, if I stab it into someone, won't kill them. I mean, we're talking that level in the 1880s. And that if I did knife you, that I didn't know it was wrong. So you really needed to elaborate, I think, in the book a little bit about what these terms mean and how they are. And the interesting is the McNaughton Rule, developed in 1840 in England, applied in 1882 and 81 in the United States, widely adopted. What do you think the main test for insanity is in the United States today? Do you guys think this is still the test for insanity, or do you think we've evolved past it? No. What do you think? It's still mainly the test for insanity in the United States, and we'll touch on that later. But you know, what the law is generally doesn't really matter. What you really have to get into, and this was available, I would have liked to have seen this in the book, is what was the actual jury instruction given. And you can see that the jury instruction fairly follows what the McNaughton Rule is basically the judge tells the jury this is the law you should apply. So under a disease of his mental faculties, if that's the proper expression, he doesn't know what he's doing, or he doesn't know it was wrong, and if that happens, then we can't find this person guilty and put them in prison because they're not responsible. They didn't have, because every crime has two parts. You have the act, I shoot the person, and then you have to have a guilty mind, known as mens rea in the legal field, is that you have to have the intent to do something wrongful. And if you're so mentally deranged that you don't know what you're doing or that it's wrong, you lack that necessary criminal intent, and therefore you shouldn't be punished. Prior to the McNaughton Rule, the way that they looked at it, the McNaughton Rule was trying to make it harder for people to get off on insanity. Prior to the McNaughton Rule, people would just look at, is this person good or do they have the possession of knowing the difference between good and bad? And if they don't, we're not going to hold them responsible. McNaughton Rule came in to try to hold more people responsible. We had people that were getting off. And all of us out here, particularly in the United States, we seem to be really worried with people getting off for the insanity defense, which statistically less than 1% of defendants offer up the insanity defense, and of those, only a quarter of those actually get off. And do you know what happens when you get off on the insanity defense? You get sent to an insane asylum for an indefinite period of time. And all the studies that have shown that people who are found not guilty by reason of insanity actually spend more time institutionalized than those who don't. Okay, so he actually, Guiteau, and this is another problem I have with the book, is the book makes it seem like his attorney isn't very good. It was his brother-in-law, and this wasn't his field. This guy was really creative and thinking outside the box. And one of the things he did is he was pushing for a new variant of the rule that said, it's called the irresistible impulse rule, and that if you don't know it was wrong, and he didn't have the power to resist it. And if you've read the book, that sounds more like what's going on with Guiteau, is that, I think I can advance my career if I get this guy out of the way, and all these other people will be grateful to me. And so he follows him around for 30 days and then eventually shoots him. But the judge said no evidence of that at trial, and so didn't let that in. So, admissible evidence. First of all, you have to have someone to actually say it in court. You have to have testimony. It has to be relevant. It has to go to prove something in court. So, the fact that he lied about writing a book, which is one of the things to show he's insane, or that he skipped in and out of his housing, or that he bought clothes that he didn't pay for, is any of that really relevant to, did he know what he was doing at the time he shot the president? And the answer is no. Typically, we want firsthand information. Hearsay, that is information where you don't actually know it, but somebody said it. And this, I guess, goes to the attribution issue, is that we're not actually saying who these things that are all quoted and the thoughts that are in the mind, like that he's looking through the window ready to shoot the president, but he decides not to do it because he doesn't want to shoot the president in front of his wife. And then fact versus opinion. We, as normal lay people, we're only really normally allowed to talk about facts and about those things that we normally could observe, and make conclusions on, like somebody smelled of alcohol. We're not allowed to give opinions. And there's a lot of quotations in the book where people say, I think he's crazy. He's acting like a crazy person. Anyway, they did call an expert at trial. And this is one of the quotes that was not in the book, but you can get from the appellate opinion, where Dr. Fordyce Barker testifies, it is not evidence of a delusion of an insane person. And he was talking about the fact that he was cheating people all the time and that he thought he was grander than he really was, because it's not the result of disease. It is the result of vanity and self-conceit and love of notoriety. These are vices and not diseases. And if you are not suffering from a disease of the mind, which, by the way, again, historical perspective, in 1880, what do you think the capacity was to know the mind, analyze the mind? If you go back and do a little research on this at the time, you'll see that they actually have pictures of Guiteau showing the bumps on his head, because it was very big at that time. Phrenology. If you could feel somebody's head, different parts of their brain were more developed. And that would have been a nice piece of historical kind of context, is what did we know about insanity at the time? All right, so burden of proof, almost done here. The state has the government has the burden of proving every element of the charged crime, which is, in this case, is pretty easy because he admits it and everybody saw him do it, right? So that's not a problem. And they have to do it beyond a reasonable doubt. So that means that no reasonable person would doubt that this happened. Guiteau, though, is putting forth an affirmative defense. And an affirmative defense, he bears the burden of proof. And so he bore the burden of proving that he's insane, because all of us are assumed to be sane, and you have to prove that you're insane, and that insanity relieves you of the burden of guilt in this case. And you have to do that by a preponderance of the evidence. That means more likely than not. So here we have the judge and the jury. The judge decides the issue of law. The jury determines the fact, weighs the credibility of evidence. And in this particular case, the judge gave the instruction I showed you before, and the jury reached the conclusion that he was guilty, so then it goes up on appeal. And on appeal, the defendant in this case, there's two different things to look at. One are issues of law. On issues of law, the court looks at it fresh. They're not bound by what the trial court did. So an issue of law would be, for example, the jury instructions that was given. And the court looks at that jury instruction on appeal and says, that's the law, that's the McNaughton rule, A-OK. Questions of fact. Did the jury get it right as to whether he's insane or not? There, when it goes up on appeal, the judges on the appellate court, in this case it is the Supreme Court of the District of Columbia, they're not seeing the testimony. All they're looking at is a cold transcript. So they give great weight to whatever the jury decided on appeal. And an example of question of fact was Guiteau suffering from a disease of the mind? And all it has to do is be supported by some substantial evidence. And we have quotations, we have his wife testifying that she never noticed anything insane in his behavior. And then the court on appeal has to decide that the judgment that this person was sane is not clearly erroneous, and makes it pretty easy to understand. So it's not that there was a miscarriage of justice as to Guiteau. It's that facts in the real world are more balanced. The decision was made during a very charged time, but was supported by competent evidence. And supported by that evidence, the Court of Appeals really had no other alternative but to uphold the verdict, which resulted in his death. Quickly, modern standards of insanity. Kansas the progressive state that we are, we have abolished the insanity defense. So basically, we only consider insanity in Kansas to the extent that it would negate the intent to commit whatever the crime might be. So if I am so crazy that I don't know that's not my car, and I just get into cars and take cars all the time, then I would not be guilty in Kansas. Missouri, as you can see, still follows pretty much the McNaughton rule. Mental disease that renders the defendant incapable of knowing or appreciating the nature, quality, and wrongfulness of the conduct. So I don't know the difference between right and wrong. And then for a while, all the way through till 1980, there was the model penal code was taking over in the United States. And it basically says diagnosed mental defect, unable to either appreciate the criminality of your conduct or conform conduct to the requirement of the law. 1980, most states in the federal government abandon that and go back to the McNaughton rule. Anybody know what happens in 1980? Any historians? Anybody know? What great white man was shot in 1980?
President
Ronald
Reagan.
Reagan. So Ronald Reagan gets shot, everyone gets terribly upset,
Right.
and we move back to, because the person who shot Ronald Reagan was under the model penal code, found to be criminally insane because he thought he was doing this to impress Jodie Foster, and that upset a lot of people, so the law went back the other way. Okay, so again, there are handouts at the table if you want it, and there's a URL if you would like to access and have these slides online, along with their notes under all the slides. And with that, I turn it over to the panel for questions.
Okay, thank you all for very interesting presentations. And I'm sure, were we going to take, someone going to go up into the audience, or hopefully people can speak up? No? Okay, all right. Do we have some questions? Okay.
All right, first of all, this is a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. But this is aimed at Todd. So,
Jane is also a historian.
I agree with everything you said. Secondly, I will never allow you to critique my work in public. But most importantly, if good history, in your estimation and my estimation, addresses things that were not addressed in this book, which sold thousands and thousands of copies, then why aren't the books that we like doing the kind of work that we think is important, talk about context and importance and all these things, why aren't those books selling thousands and thousands and thousands of copies?
Right, okay, I think there's a couple of things to that. Yeah, so why does good history not sell?
It's boring.
Right. So that, I would say that that's the standard belief, right?
It's long.
Now, if you think that this is good history, I'd argue you're not reading much real history. But I would argue there are aspects of historical texts that are written by historians, make arguments, and are popularly accessible. But a lot of times, those aren't the ones we're picking for a common read. So one that I'm really liking right now is Michael Jordan and the New Global Capitalism. It's written by Walter Lefebvre, great historian. It's amazing. It deals with our modern life. It's super skinny. He uses Michael Jordan as a foil for globalization, the end of the Cold War, and the rise of terrorism. And it's really excellent. So I would argue there are good ones out there. And there are historians that write popular texts without the footnotes and all of the horrible citations you guys hate. We just need to make sure that those are sort of privileged and rise to the top. So I would say a couple of things to answer your question. First, access. I think students are not accessing, or popular audiences are not accessing a lot of those sources, or they don't realize that they're sort of out in the public sphere. And second, we as scholars need to do a good job of producing that kind of literature. It's on us to do this, and promoting the ones that are good. So I would say that that's the things that I work on. And those are the gateway drugs, I think, to students. Now, if you want to get super cynical, who likes to read books about dead white men? Old white men. And you know what they do? They buy books, right? And so if we want to get super cynical, Millard needs to sell her book if she wants to keep being a writer. So you should pick people that you know are a built-in consumption audience. Garfield might be her most off-topic. Theodore Roosevelt's her other one, and Winston Churchill is her upcoming book. And those are people whose name recognition people will probably be motivated to consume. So I think that, I mean, a really cynical person would say this is pandering for profit. But there are other books, right? I would say a lot of you could relate to Michael Jordan. That would be a text that would be accessible. It is a popular text written by a good historian, and we just need to do a better job, I think,
Where
of
would-
displacing this.
Where would you suggest that students go, other than you saying one
Right.
title?
Right. Well, so you can, of course, ask your history instructors, because I know you're all taking great history classes and you love your professors, so you could start there. But second, libraries, right? Librarians have excellent access to especially new and exciting work, and librarians are a resource that I think students are not exploiting, and you need to, because we have, JCCC is extremely lucky to have strong libraries and strong librarians. So you should just wander in there. They do a great display every week, like every month they change it for a theme, and they pick out great texts. They always privilege their news sources, which are really great. And we have a lot of new work that's accessible that you should be seeking out. So I guess we need to get your butts in the library.
Okay.
And if I may, I want to add
Yeah.
on that I think a lot of it is also that we have this conception of history as I pointed out, as names and dates.
Right.
And large part of that is because a lot of, as Ty said,
Yeah.
it's interpretation. And so a lot of times historians are arguing and presenting a case for something. They're not writing and telling a story.
Right.
And so that's one of the other reasons why I think that a lot of history books don't make the bestseller list, is because they're not story. And historians need to do a better job of writing history as story, focusing on these sorts of
Right.
topics and these individuals and these themes that are not great white men.
Right.
We maybe need a hybrid sort of,
Yeah, I
Exactly.
mean, maybe we need two versions of everything we write, Jay, right? The one for the academic audience and the one that can be useful in our
exactly,
classrooms. Yeah.
exactly. Keith?
Yeah, I had this conversation with other people here about, it has to do with the way graduate students are trained. And in graduate school in English, not necessarily in creative writing, but in literary scholarship, and I don't know what it's like in history, but it kind of deadens your, it actually kind of deadens your ability to write because of the demands of the discipline. And I was wondering if you feel that perhaps the stylistic tendencies of the graduate programs tend to work against the actual dissemination of information and scholarship that you actually acquire.
Right. Yeah, well, I think like we were talking about before, there's a difference between writing for an academic audience and writing for a popular audience. You're not trained, at least I wasn't in graduate school, Jamie, you can speak to this, for popular audience writing. But I would also argue that in graduate school, you're often not taught how to teach. If you really want to get students interested, I don't care if I wrote the best book ever, most of you would not read it. But I see 150 students a semester in my classroom, and that's where I need to do a good job. Because that's where you're gonna maybe take one or a few of your only history classes, and that's where I have to make it relevant to your life now, which is why I'm like, this isn't relatable, right? When I teach history, I try to make it relatable to your life, and your lives are complicated, right? This is nice that this has a nice beginning, end, and it gets to the finish line, but your life is messy and this doesn't relate to it. So history is messy because it's filled with people, and if we make that relatable and include the diverse people that existed, that also mirrors a lot of the diversity you face today, then we're doing a good job. It's not only in reading that you can access historical material, it's also in things like this.
Okay, all right, thank you. Another question? Okay,
What do you guys think about it, when she wrote about Belle? Do you think she gave him too much credit? Do you think she didn't maybe not address some of the issues that he had surrounding him, his opinions?
Such as?
Well, he was, trying to think of it.
Uh-huh.
Euthanasia.
Okay, yeah.
He was big in that, I'm trying to remember the word for that whole.
Yeah, well, I would say like all of the people in the book, there's very little context. And there's also, for me, the big thing that you don't see context on Belle is in terms of Gilded Age political maneuvering, right? This whole, and economical maneuvering, right? So how do I mess with patents in order to make sure that I'm still the profit seeker,
Right,
build a trust to have control of my hardware and thus the software arguably that are used for it. So that he's not portrayed in that way. If
Yeah.
anyone wants to speak to his other less moral pursuits.
What about the legal issues involved in that as
Yeah,
well?
yeah,
I think
sure.
that's fairly relevant, Jay, with
Okay.
the
Right.
patent law and trademark law at the time.
Well, and it's not developed, there's no real narrative, but he clearly was an inventor, and although some people would argue that he was capitalizing on other people's inventions
Right.
to a great extent. But in this particular case, everything seemed to be bent toward the single narrative, so we have him coming in and he being foiled.
Right.
And I don't know what I didn't do research on that issue, so I don't know what first-party sources are available to flush that out.
And the other thing to remember is that Millard admits she started to write a book about Bell. That was
Oh, is
going
that
to be
right?
her
Right.
focus when
okay.
she
Yeah.
started investigating. And of course, like anybody, when you start writing, you don't want to throw that away. So his writing's hard. So I wrote all this, how can I use it somewhere else? And so I think that's
Right.
probably another reason why she drew him in as one of her major strands. She had
Right.
already done a lot of research before her attention got drawn to Garfield, and she then decided to switch subjects. And she said, well, I can work this in. From a creative writing perspective, from a structural perspective, it works. And to have Belle as the foil to Bliss,
Right.
kind of the protagonist versus the foil of Bliss, rather,
Right.
kind of works nicely for the narrative that she has constructed. And it is a constructive narrative, as Ty points out. She is leaving out so much.
Right.
Because she's primarily just focusing on dramatic unity of the
Right.
stories.
Right.
Right. And Mary, I would like to ask, while you were talking all the thing about sepsis, although you didn't want to make your presentation all about that, we started with people not believing
Right.
in the idea at all, and we now have walls all around the college where you just have to walk up and get a little hand sanitizer. And we're now to a point where almost every time you try to buy soap, it's hard to buy any that doesn't have an antibacterial
Yeah.
agent in it, to the point where I know we are creating superbugs,
Right.
et cetera.
Right.
What do you think, where did things go wrong, or?
Yeah. Well, I think we still don't totally understand that. I mean, we know that certainly in developing countries where you don't have the ability for good hand washing, there's a greater problem, but we still have so many complications with infection in our own country that, we have caused part of it by treating everything, by this, antibiotic. We have so much resistance now to antibiotics and the re-emerging of infections that has occurred. And the other thing is just trying to better understand the whole inflammatory process. Infection causes inflammation, and then, initially that's a good thing, but in the long run, if we have a lot of that, how it contributes to disease, heart disease, the way our arteries look. So I'm not against hand washing by any means. But, yeah.
We have another question up there. Toyin?
My question is really more towards the medical aspect of it. Like, actually, when you look at the book, they really painted that this septic was actually what killed him. They just said it was infected.
Right.
Like it was just a mere infection, but it was infection on top of infection that actually made him septic and he eventually died. But looking at it from a medical perspective, we also talk about when you also treat some things with antibacterial or whatever you use, your body gets to develop some resistance to at some point. And when you look at the medical field, even in the present day, most especially in relation to infants, when you take them to the hospital and they say, oh, this is what is wrong, but would like this thing to run its course and not actually make
Do anything, yeah.
the baby or something, and let the natural defense or natural
Immunity, yeah.
immunity come in. And now, in the case of Garfield, we'll look at it, apart from the infection that he got from the puncturing of the wound or trying to locate the bullets in him, even the condition of the White House in which the lead at that time wasn't even a good place elsewise for somebody who has an opening in his body, and all of the things that was going on around him too. I think all of those things also
Contributed.
to
Right.
what made him septic.
Right, absolutely. Well, there really wasn't the awareness then, or the understanding of what germs were and how, the introduction of germs could complicate wound healing. I mean, I think Garfield's body was really trying hard to
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, I was
find itself.
wondering how it
Yeah.
lasted. I mean, he
he-
lasted 2 months.
He really did.
2.5 months. and
The
that
body's
kind of
amazing,
right.
you know,
My
so he was
students-
trying.
Okay,
My
all
student
right,
said that
thank
pus
you.
is
I
another
think
barrier
it's
at the end.
time, thank all of our panelists,
Did they do
and
what?
thank all of
The
you
bus is
for being a
another
great
barrier.
audience.